Hello and welcome to the Legal Genie Podcast with me, Lara Quie. Why am I the Legal Genie? Because I bring out the magic in you and help you make your wishes come true. I practiced as a corporate lawyer in London for a number of years before leaving the law to become an entrepreneur and co-founder of a successful designer kitchen business. Upon selling the business 10 years ago and moving to Asia, I moved back into law, but not as a lawyer. Most recently, I was the Asia Pacific Head of Business Development for a leading international law firm. Due to an unexpected life event in 2020, I discovered the power of executive coaching and recently launched Lara Quie Associates, a boutique consultancy which enables me to work with fun and inspiring people across the globe. This podcast explores the fascinating world of the legal ecosystem and the people within it. From rainmakers at global elite firms to trainees just starting to get their feet wet. From Queen's Counsel, barristers, in-house counsel and the judiciary to legal tech innovators, pricing specialists, HR managers, business development and marketing professionals, legal headhunters and everyone else who is a mover and shaker in this space. My goal is to help you see your world differently. What insights can you gain from hearing others share their experiences? What action can you take as a result? I hope that you will be inspired and learn a lot from this episode. Please enjoy the conversation. Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Legal Genie Podcast with me, your host, Lara Quie. Today, I'm privileged and delighted to be joined by Sara Carnegie. Sara has spent the bulk of her career working with the public sector in collaboration with influential government ministers, officials, the senior judiciary, lawyers, and law enforcement on a range of issues. She was the Director of Strategic Policy at the Crown Prosecution Service and legal advisor to the Senior Presiding Judge, which involved leading the judicial team and working with the Lord Chief Justice, government and key stakeholders to implement broadcasting in the Court of Appeal. She has also led the legal teams for 2 high-profile and sensitive public inquiries, resulting in far-reaching change across relevant government departments. She sits in a judicial capacity on the Council of the Inns of Court Disciplinary Tribunal and also the advisory board for the National Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse. Her current role as Director of Legal Projects at the International Bar Association involves working in a global capacity, leading a legal team who research, develop and implement innovative projects relevant to business, the rule of law, the global legal profession and wider community. Significant projects include bullying, sexual harassment, and addressing mental well-being in the legal profession, modern slavery, and cybersecurity. She is currently a member of the IBA Diversity and Inclusion Council and Rule of Law Forum and plays a central role in running initiatives and events to support both entities. Well, that is quite a pedigree, Sara. I'm sure our listeners will agree. And so I would love to start off by welcoming you to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
And to, start right at the beginning. So tell me a little bit about your childhood and background and where you grew up.
Well, I grew up in a beautiful country village in Wiltshire, which is quite different to London, very country-based, of course. So as fields and grass, which feels like a real contrast to where I've been living for the last 20-odd years. And I was an only child. I went to a local school and probably always a bit loud and precocious and liked drama. And when I was about 14, I heard a barrister speak at one of the school careers evenings and decided that was the career for me, but simultaneously also heard a diplomat speak and decided I would love to travel and do international things. So I had sort of 2 career ideas as to where I wanted to go, which I think makes where I am at the moment now quite perfect because it has combined aspects of both choices. But I also had a very sort of integral interest in all things crime-based. So I did know that when I chose the career in the law, that criminal law was going to be my preference, which is what I did in the first instance.
Right. Yes. And so I know that you did law and French at university with that international outlook. And have you ever used your French at all in any capacity?
Sadly not. I mean, I always loved French. I used to spend a lot of time in France when I was in my teenage years with a French family. And so had obviously spoken really quite good level spoken French, which is a bit rusty now, I'm sad to say. But no, I mean, I never had the opportunity to use it because my career choices, certainly for the first nearly 20 years, were very domestic. So the opportunity to speak another language was pretty much nil. But I wanted to retain it as long as I could, which is why I chose a course that enabled me to live in France for a year and study there, which was great fun.
Yeah, I did a French and German degree myself, so I did enjoy that year abroad too. Yes. So tell me a bit about your early career, being a barrister in chambers and getting a pupillage. Was that challenging at all?
I mean, I think it was certainly hard then, and this was back in 1998 when I started my pupillage, and it was really hard to get pupillage. There's no doubt about it. There were definitely far too many people emerging from law school, from bar school, who clearly, had to end up waiting for some time before they secured a pupillage, or had to choose other career options in order to earn money because there just weren't enough spaces. I understand it's got a lot worse now, and whilst they now remunerate pupillage, which they didn't do when I took on the whole experience, I had to do it for free. I understand lots, far too many people are coming through the system for the places available, and that is a real problem. But especially when you consider how expensive bar school is. So when I was there, it was about £20,000 for the year. It's obviously now a lot more. But if you then don't get the guaranteed career path, that's quite a significant amount of debt that many people are coming out with. But yeah, pupillage was tough. I had a really tricky first 6 months. I wouldn't want to speak negatively about my pupil master, but I didn't find him to be very easy. Although I did learn a lot, the characteristics were hard. And so, it was not an easy experience. And I think what I also felt definitely during that time, and this is why the project that we've been engaged in recently is so interesting, I felt there was a lot of fairly low-level sexual harassment and misogyny, and it has improved, but there was undoubtedly experiences that I now look back on and I think, no way would I want my daughter tolerating that. But, we know it's prevalent in the legal profession. We've seen the statistics. So it's, it just goes to show that we do need to tackle it more than ever.
Absolutely. And I imagine barristers' chambers, because of the way they're set up, it's much harder to sort of regulate and actually keep a very close eye on what happens. Yeah. I mean,
they are obviously self-employed. Barristers are working within normally a set of chambers, and there's still rules and behaviour and the regulations that they have to adhere to. So my time working on the Council of the Inns of Court Disciplinary Tribunal, I did that for 7 years. And in fact, I have actually now finished. So you can't do more than 7 years before you have to take a break, and then you can reapply after 2 years. But, you can see that the codes of conduct are obviously really rigorous. They're applied, exceptionally well and frequently when barristers transgress. And, it just depends on the bravery quite often in a sexual harassment or bullying context of a victim who is willing to speak out, because we know that it can have a career impact if it makes people appear to be as if they're complaining. And it depends on the gravity of the offence, of course. But I think a lot of people just put up with the low-level behaviours because they don't want to be seen as troublemakers, and they don't want to be, don't want to experience an adverse consequence for themselves, which is always quite psychologically tricky.
Absolutely, yes. So tell us about that time as a criminal barrister, and what sort of things did you witness, and can you tell us anything juicy?
Well, I mean, I feel like a bit of a fraud, to be honest, because I didn't do it for that long. I mean, I did secure a tenancy in the end. I was lucky, but one of my biggest frustrations in it was the sheer amount of travel and the getting your brief at 6 o'clock in the evening ready for a trial somewhere obscure in part of the country that took 3 hours to get to the next morning. So even though I loved it, and I loved, the different challenges every day, the different venues, the meeting new people, it was nothing. It was ever the same. It was exhausting. And at the end of my first year, I remember I'd made about £11,000 in total. So I had about no tax to pay. And I remember thinking, I'm actually out of pocket really when I look at all of the expenses. And with the criminal bar, and it has been a real problem for many years, and legal aid payments and the way you're paid, often it's delayed, so you don't get paid, immediately after your case in a normal sense. You often have to chase the solicitor, and your clerks are busy trying to constantly pursue all the money you're owed. So you're always worrying about your income at the junior end. And as I imagine it's much worse now from everything I've read. But it really was utterly exhausting. And I had a friend who I'd been a pupil with who'd got a contract within Revenue and Customs as a prosecution lawyer. And she was very keen for me to join her and said, look, you get paid £45,000 a year and you get normal hours and you get all your holidays and everything else. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll try it. Maybe I'll see if that, for a year, just to get myself financially into a safer place and then consider going back to the bar. And I had this grand vision that I'd make lots of contacts within that organisation to then give me steady prosecution work. So I'd then have a much more regular flow of income. And yeah, and then as is always the way with these things, you move into a different scenario and you end up staying because things, well, in that instance, it ended up being a much better lifestyle for me, and the cases I did were fascinating. But yeah, I'll be honest with you, in that the first few years of the bar, the bulk of my work was the low-level crime, the sort of everyday magistrate stuff that you see, the burglaries, the drink drivings, the assaults. I had a few interesting cases and did represent people who'd murdered people or raped people, of course, but in a more limited sense. So I would do mentions and bail hearings and things on behalf of more senior members of chambers. But yes, it was generally that kind of low to medium level crime that I was covering in that time, with a few sort of juicier cases thrown in for good measure.
And so then at the Revenue and Customs Prosecutions Office, what sort of cases are those?
Well, then after about the first, just under a year, started being really exciting. I mean, you start off in any job being given, the immediate, relatively quick and easy work to get you into the swing of what's required. And so I did still go to court, and I prosecuted lists largely in places like Dover and Horsham, where they had people coming through from abroad, and they had, drugs importations or tobacco and excise goods importations, and money laundering or other illicit things like naughty videos or other sorts of things that were coming through which were contraband. So I would prosecute those, and then some cases would be Crown Court and more serious. And of course, it then escalated towards the very high-level serious organised crime networks and starting to take on cases involving serious criminal gangs that were, major drug dealers and drug smugglers, which, became more interesting because you then have the money laundering aspects and the people at the sort of more high-end level. So I'd be working with officers very much at the early stage of the investigation, engaging in discussions around what they were finding on the evidential side, which would lead up to a decision to charge. So that became really exciting. It felt much more like you were part of a law enforcement investigation team that was really uncovering the different facets of what was going on through a variety of means that are obviously fairly sensitive, but you'd be dealing with issues like informants and undercover operations and stuff like that. So it quite quickly became really interesting, and I did that for a while, but gradually taking on a significant caseload for the Serious Organised Crime Agency, which then became the NCA, the National Crime Agency now.
Wow. I wondered, did you ever, worry for your personal safety, if you're involved in those kind of prosecutions against serious organised criminals?
I didn't. There was only one time where I think I felt anxiety because I prosecuted a very significant criminal gang. And generally I was on the sort of more anonymous side of the arrangement. So I would be liaising with solicitors, but I wasn't in court doing the prosecution as a stand-up barrister anymore. I was very much the kind of lawyer organising all the material and dealing with the front end from the kind of evidential assessment side. But I was in court once, and I was quite heavily pregnant with my second child. And one of the defendants, who was, and I knew a lot more about him than he did about me, was sitting in the dock, and he mouthed something completely inappropriate and sexual to me. And I remember sitting there and first sort of blushing and feeling this enormous sense of embarrassment, but then also feeling a little bit scared because this person had been involved in some very serious stuff, including gang murders and things. And I just thought, oh God, He knows my name, he knows where I work, and this, when you're pregnant, you're obviously far more anxious about your own vulnerability because of that. So yeah, I do remember at that point thinking, yeah, this is a nasty business. The people here in this world are obviously not good. And one of the guys had already nobbled the jury on that case, so we'd already had a second jury that had to be convened after he'd stalked the first. So we knew they weren't within themselves beyond the reach of trying to change the direction of the trial.
Wow. Yes. And so you mentioned that you were pregnant with your second child at that stage, but I know that you're a mother of 3. And so how have you coped with motherhood during your career in law?
It's tough. I mean, I think having my first child, who's 18 next week, which is really scary, was one of the reasons actually that I didn't go back to chambers. I mean, I thought long and hard about missing being in court and doing the wig and the gown work and really having those sort of more dramatic moments, I suppose, which is how a lot of people see it, but quite the reality all the time. But I figured that the way my life was and the challenges that I had, I was a single parent for a period of time, and I couldn't imagine trying to juggle the demands of that, being at the bar with the salary nightmares and anxiety and the hours needed for working, with the need to be a mother and to manage my son. And I think the working environment in the civil service is far more conducive to parenthood and to balance. So you do end up with more reasonable hours. I mean, you work hard and it is quite stressful, but there's certainly guaranteed income, guaranteed holiday. Your weekends are pretty much your own. And so the lifestyle becomes just a lot more straightforward, even if you do then miss out on some of the things which obviously, I'd enjoyed previously. But, it took me in a different direction. And so I'm for anything really, but I feel like you make your choice depending on where you are at the time.
Right. And so after revenue and customs, what did you do next?
Well, I certainly worked there for a while, and I escalated in the types of career, in types of case that I was focused on. So that became, quite intense. And I then started to think about progression. I was a senior case lawyer there, and an opportunity arose to do something that I thought I'll try. I've never done anything like it before, and that was working on the public inquiry, the first one that I went for. And it was a secondment, so it didn't mean leaving the kind of home part of the government that I was part of, or not government, because of course prosecution agencies aren't formally part of government, but civil service certainly. And I decided to try for it. I was interviewed and I was asked to join the team. So I became, first of all, the deputy head of the legal team. So I had a boss who was quite seasoned in running public inquiries. And it was about Iraqi victim who had been murdered, essentially, by the army during detention in Iraq back in 2003. So it was called the Baha Musa inquiry, and we did do a full report that's in the public domain. But it was a really different environment to anything I'd done before, albeit still with a criminal justice flavour to it, because of course there was allegations of torture and murder, and in fact, that had in fact happened. So it was, a really intense experience, a very different type of thing, but it led me down a different career path, and I never then went back to being a sort of standard prosecuting case lawyer.
Yes, but you were involved in another public inquiry as well. So was that because you had enjoyed the first one so much?
Yes, I mean, I was asked to do the second one off the back of the first one, although I had my third child partway through the first one. So I had been on maternity leave, and during that I was asked by somebody who was running government inquiries within what is now the government legal department, whether I'd be interested. And I still had to meet the panel and effectively be interviewed. But yeah, I was asked to join and head up the legal team from there was two legal teams. One is counsel who presents, and the other was called the solicitors team, even though I'm a barrister. So I headed up that. And it was on highly sensitive matters around detainee treatment, again in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was a fascinating experience, absolutely fascinating. And I did that for 18 months before the inquiry was closed for external reasons.
Mm-hmm. And so what happened after that? What did you do next?
Well, then I went to be the legal advisor to the Senior Presiding Judge. So I worked in the Royal Courts of Justice, which was which was very much like going from being in very classic civil servant buildings and environments to suddenly going into effectively like Hogwarts. I mean, if you know what the Royal Courts of Justice looked like in London on Fleet Street, I mean, it's a beautiful building. I think they say it's got about 1,000 rooms in it. I mean, it's absolutely vast, and obviously big stone corridors and red carpet running down the middle. It's an amazing place to work, and quite daunting because obviously the judges are very intellectually demanding and serious, but lovely people. I mean, I had a great time there, and I worked directly as legal advisor to the Senior Presiding Judge. So I would be drafting policies and working alongside other judges, both in court, but also all around the country. So we'd work with all the different Crown Court judges and magistrates as well to try and, develop different codes of what they were doing and to give guidance and support. And like I say, during that time, I did the work with media to introduce cameras in court. So broadcasting from the Court of Appeal, which was the first. That never happened in the UK. So that was introduced after huge amounts of negotiation, and I drafted some of the law around that, and then the training and the protocols. And that was quite a challenge because you're trying to bring two completely different mindsets, those of the judiciary with their inherent need to avoid a circus in court and to, have grandstanding and to see real changes in behaviour and to protect the victims and ultimately members of the public. And of course, the media anxious to see, interesting trials unfold, and that's their longer term aspirations. Let's effectively be like, the US and have the O.J. Simpson trials, or the like South Africa, Oscar Pistorius. That case was going on whilst we were trying to work through the arrangements. And I think there was a real sense, you could have these one in every 2 or 3 years cases where the media is just completely descending and the public is fascinated and watching every moment because it's a celebrity or because it's particularly gruesome and complex as a serial killer or something of that nature. And it can make amazing television. Unfortunately, the Court of Appeal stuff I'm not sure does. So it was a sort of thin end of the wedge, perhaps a means to the ultimate end. And I know that work still continues. I think they've secured sentencing remarks now in the Crown Court, but it's one of those things where I think sometimes the hope is quite different to the reality for the vast majority of time in terms of the real content of what you get in a court. It's quite dry, it's often quite hard and not digestible for the average member of the public to really sit through and be excited about.
But it was a dramatic change in terms of the judiciary and the way that the courts work in such a, an ancient, traditional way. So it was a massive change. But it was important to strike the balance between showing transparency and at the same time not over glamorizing criminality, because as you mentioned, we don't want serial killers to have notoriety and to want to make their mark on society by doing those kind of things. It's fascinating because I'm a bit strange. I do like watching my serial killer documentaries. It's obviously the bit of me that still, really loves the whole crime scene. But, I've been watching the Netflix documentaries on, the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. And, even back in the 80s, there's always cameras in court and you see, the whole world can see this individual who created a whole reign of terror and get this sense of being much more involved in the process. Because in the States and some jurisdictions, they do put these things out there and you do feel a sense of, right, that looks familiar now. I understand what the courtroom looks like and roughly how it works, because most members of the public just don't. They wouldn't have a clue. And I think there can be some value in that. And I agree, it can turn into a complete media circus. But, if you're a victim of crime and you've never been in a courtroom or never seen one or never understood what it might look like, it can be a terrifying prospect. And I'm not saying having seen it on TV makes it any easier, but perhaps a level of familiarity might help some people understand what they're getting into. I think that there's a lot of TV programs about law and certainly looking at programs like Suits and I'm dating myself. Ally McBeal, if you remember her.
Mm.
Yes, I always used to think, my goodness, it's really nothing like that. But it's funny to think that even though you were involved in very serious criminal cases, that you still enjoy watching these things as well.
No, it's weird, and my eldest son loves it too. So we sit there watching these things, and I also listen to podcasts, and like true crime podcasts or ones that haven't been solved. And I don't know why. I just find the whole process of the investigation and the analysis and how the evidence unfolds. And for me, that's always been fascinating. And I had a brief thought about going into the police force. Actually, I did some work experience with the police force, and I really enjoyed working with them and met some fantastic, very dedicated people who work extremely hard. And so I guess it's just part of me that just always finds that kind of thing hugely intriguing and satisfying to be involved with as well.
Yes. And so, yeah, but then is this the stage when you moved to the International Bar Association, or is there something else really happened in between? Yes.
I then went for a job that became available. It was a brand new role, actually, that they introduced to be the Director of Strategic Policy at the Crown Prosecution Service. So it was a job where my direct boss was the Director of Public Prosecutions, and I was lucky enough to get the job and went across there. And I stayed there for about 3 years, and I did that. I had built up a team, and we covered a range of things, including we covered the responsibility for the CPS engagement with the inquiry on child sexual abuse. So that was it's still ongoing. In fact, it's a huge inquiry that's been divided into about 14 different parts. But we had to do a lot of work with them on providing them with material that had been generated over a number of years, often, involving sensitive things. And that was interesting. But the rest of my work involved all sorts of really complex activity and quite important work for the DPP, such as briefing her in preparation for appearances at select committee hearings, which could be really grueling. So my team and I would put together a significant brief trying to cover all aspects of what the CPS was doing, but preparing for particular areas of criticism where maybe the statistics showed that the prosecution figures didn't look as positive as perhaps government might like to see. Particular areas, classically rapes always under close scrutiny. Modern slavery was a real interest for one of the former prime ministers here, and domestic abuse, things like that, where there were real sort of civil society interest and obviously a close eye being paid to how that would play out in terms of confidence in the system and in the prosecution service. So you were often dealing with these quite sort of nutty areas. We were also looking, I was part of a overarching government board on child sexual abuse strategy work. And so that really started my interest. I had done cases involving child abuse before that, but understanding the impact of technology on child abuse and the proliferation of images, the live streaming of child abuse, and I'm still involved to some extent in work in that regard now, and it's just shocking. I mean, the numbers and the difficulty with which you actually get people, given the sheer volume of it out there and the numbers that are actually being caught, it's shocking. And it's a never-ending problem with technology being as accessible and international as it is. So, yeah, I mean, that was a deeply traumatic but important part of the work I was doing. So yeah, I was there for 3 years before moving into the private sector, although it's a not-for-profit sector that I'm now in my current role.
Yes, it sounds like you've done some really, really, significant and impactful work, throughout your career, whether to do with, the criminal or the everyday. And I can imagine that it must be just really harrowing to deal with these kind of cases. And how did you, balance your work, perhaps sort of isolate your work mentally, because dealing with those kind of topics must be very difficult. How did you actually cope?
Well, I think that's the level on which you deal with something. I mean, obviously, I was dealing with things which were highly unpleasant and upsetting, but I wasn't very often dealing with the direct victims or dealing with the detailed, witness statements and information about, the actual stuff that was going on. I mean, of course, I have seen that. And, I was involved briefly with the police in training judges, and we had to show images, and they were highly sensitive, and they were obviously taken on an encrypted computer, and it was all done. But that really bothered me, because I'd gone out of my way not to see images in the past, and seeing that was horrendous. But I think my sympathy always went more with the people that were doing this day in, day out, the lawyers that were prosecuting or even defending cases involving, rape and sexual abuse and all sorts of things on a regular basis. And that was their day job, essentially. And the officers, the law enforcement officers that are also dealing with this, that are actually grading the photographs that they find on suspect computers. And they're beyond words. And obviously, it's not for now to even begin to go there, but it really is. That's the real kind of hard end of the activity. So I never felt like I was exposed in that way. But of course, you work out in your mind a way of rationalizing it and being resilient, because you know that there is an important thing to be achieved at the end of this. So it should really increase your desire to try and see a more just outcome, and to try and start bringing about better ways of preventing and addressing these problems, whether it's through technology cooperation, whether it's through greater sanctions, whether it's through different investigative techniques. And there's a whole range of options, of course, out there, and it's a mix of all, to be honest. But you have to think, well, I'm actually here for a really powerful reason. What's more important in a way than protecting our children globally? They are the most important thing that lead to our future, and seeing the numbers that are adversely affected by this, and knowing what that does to people as they grow up, and how it can create a cycle is such an important area for us all to be aware of and address.
Yeah, and so it ties in very nicely, though, with the work that you're currently doing at the IBA, because you're also involved in lots of very, hard-hitting projects in that area, especially to do with the legal profession, where bullying, harassment, etc., does go on. So tell us a bit about the work you're doing now.
Well, I joined the International Bar Association at the beginning of 2019, and I knew very little about it, and I was a little daunted because it's largely a sort of corporate law facing entity that holds annual conferences and many conferences throughout the year across a range of legal subjects. And it has been, I think, traditionally quite commercially law focused, albeit we have an independent entity that's part of us, that's the Human Rights Institute. And there's some fantastic, broader human rights work going on there. But it's something that I've been interested in, how the law operates, in a broader scale than just domestically, and what the different issues are across borders. So whether that's around behaviours such as, how are lawyers behaving? Where's in terms of corruption, in terms of ethical behaviours in the workplace as well. And then the broader issues again. And I managed to, not just purely through my own efforts, but to bring in aspects of my prior criminal justice work into the work that I'm now doing to some extent. So not so much in terms of the bullying and sexual harassment, although that can, of course, veer into the criminal side, but things like the modern slavery work, where, again, there's obviously a criminal angle to that, whether through forced labour, whether through human trafficking, whether through sexual trafficking, whichever part you're looking at, there's often criminality behind it or different motivations. So learning more about that has been absolutely fascinating. I mean, depressing, but fascinating, and trying to work out how we are going to tackle that, but using, instead of thinking through the law enforcement lens, which has been my past approach, looking through the business lens. What can business do to counter the problems here, and to try and reduce the demand and really tackle the problems from a different perspective? And then it's only by taking all those different approaches to a global problem worth billions in revenue a year that you might start to make an impact. Simply going after it with police is never going to be enough. And I think, creating different levers that bring about change, whether it's through consumer behaviour, business behaviour, international agencies' behaviour. There's lots of aspects to this which make it huge and complex, but being involved in it from that perspective has been so far incredible. We do a range of projects. So I cover a team of lawyers who are specialists in different areas. So I have a business and human rights specialist. I have someone who's into the more tech, does cybersecurity, cryptocurrency, blockchain, all these things, which until I joined the IBA, I'd barely ever heard of anything like blockchain or the Internet of Things. But again, part of that can be linked to criminality like cybersecurity. That's really interesting. And we're doing some work in that area now. And also covering work, which is more, as I say, the sort of behavioral aspects. How are people, we did a survey in 2019 of lawyers and legal professionals around the world, and we had a record response of over 7,000 people who indicated their experience of bullying and sexual harassment, and the numbers were staggering. To see that 1 in 3 had experienced bullying and sexual harassment as well, absolutely terrifying statistics, particularly even in the last 12 months. So it's not a problem that's been confined to history. This is an ongoing problem that's never been addressed within a profession where integrity and good character is meant to underlie what we do. And people come to us for advice. We're there representing the answers, in theory, the way forward, the justice approach. And if we can't treat ourselves properly within that world of professionalism, then it does beg a number of questions. So addressing it from my perspective certainly was absolutely key. And it led to one of our biggest ever campaigns with events in over 30 cities around the world. And I had a colleague on the team, Kieran Pender, who did a tremendous job of both drafting the report and then promulgating its message. And we must have reached thousands of lawyers across different parts of the world. And we also dealt with non-legal professionals. So we had an event with the EU Commission. We had an event with the World Bank. We really tried to make sure that this message could be valuable with different professions also experiencing unhealthy levels of sexual harassment or bullying. And it came off the back of the Me Too movement. So, Harvey Weinstein and that work, in a way did us a favor, because culturally and socially it became really important to start talking about this. Women were coming forward and feeling emboldened by the fact that the media was saying, these are the things that have been happening. It's outrageous. So that translated across into the legal profession.
Yes, and I think, what you point out is that the legal profession is, quite traditional, and it's very hierarchical, where you've got everybody labelled, trainee and paralegal and associate, senior associate of counsel, partner. And the truth is that if you're to complain about something that someone has done, unfortunately, it is usually the victim who suffers. And very few law firms will actually take action against an extremely high billing partner. And so it's, at the end of the day, it's all about the money. And so it is about having, structures and processes in place that protect everybody, because also there can be malicious complaints as well. We do have to balance that. So it's important that these things are very, clearly dealt with, very transparently, objectively, so that people feel safe in being able to get justice. And this is what the irony is, the lack of justice and the lack of integrity, and the lack of trust, and all of that within the profession itself. And yes, that is very disheartening to see when you are in there and you feel powerless. But it's about power at the end of the day, and having, yes.
Well, that seems to be the direction of change that we're seeing. I mean, you've seen high profile cases in Australia where, even very senior judges have been held to account to some extent. I think there's still ongoing work in that space, but, people being brave and coming forward, but usually often quite long after the events in question. And then essentially added credibility is added by other people coming forward and saying, yes, actually that happened to me. He did that to me as well. And that's where, often the evidence in these cases is very difficult, because all you have is one word against the other, and no other sort of, there's very rarely proof beyond that, that something happens. So it's terribly difficult, as is the case with, many sexual offence cases, in the absence of injuries, particularly if they're historic events, it's very much one word against the other. So you're right. I mean, these do take a tremendous amount of courage on the part of the victim. And in fact, the number of malicious complaints is very, very small. people don't often want to put themselves through that, particularly if it involves a very senior person, if they're just making it up. But of course, you have to guard against that. There should be proper systems in place to ensure that, there is a fair process. And, I'm very much for that, having been on both sides of the justice system, both defending and prosecuting. I know the importance of ensuring that it's a robust and tested process, but that makes it, that does inevitably make it really tough for a victim. A victim does need to be, or a complainant, as often they are referred to, certainly in this jurisdiction, needs to be, aware of what they're letting themselves in for, and willing to endure a certain level of stress. It's almost inevitable.
Yes. And so what else are you noticing about the private practice legal environment? Because obviously your experience for your actual career was sort of quite different, yeah. But the IBA members are generally private practice lawyers, aren't they? Yeah. So what have you noticed about the legal profession currently, and changes and anything that you've seen?
Well, obviously, we're currently in the middle of an incredibly random, difficult, strange time, which presents a whole array of different challenges. And prior to that, I had the role for a year, and I'd met some fantastic people all around the world. I'd travelled a fair bit, and there's some really fantastic lawyers that are working as volunteers within the IBA. And in a way, my biggest observation about it was, if only we could reach more people, but the business model of the organisation is such that it tends to attract the commercial lawyers who come along to events for networking purposes, and there's a real range of people, as you'd expect, but they're often obviously exceptionally clever, very interesting people, but they are there, they're the top of their game, the sorts of people that I'm meeting. They're often partners or very senior within their particular legal field. So, you're dealing with really impressive and capable individuals. As with any organisation, there are a few people there that are difficult, that are not straightforward to deal with. But on the in the main, they're incredibly courteous and really sort of impressive individuals. And you have to be able to build good relationships with them in order to achieve anything in the project work that we do. Our project work doesn't sit alone; it has to engage different constituencies of the organisation. So we have to work with members who are giving up their time, and when they're immensely busy people, they have to be sort of passionate about the issue they're dealing with, and they have to feel appropriately supported, because their time is finite. So you do have to be diplomatic, even if people can be challenging and sometimes not many, but sometimes quite demanding. And you have to accept that they don't always want to respond to your emails really quickly. So there's a lot of that going on, and it's a different dynamic to working with someone as an immediate colleague. But it has been interesting to see their world, about which I knew relatively little, having never directly worked with it. The challenges they face, the hours they work, the different approach to their work, perhaps from the civil service, because the incentives are different, the pressures are different. And that links to the work that we're now involved in on mental well-being in the legal profession. And I know that's another buzzword. It's something that people have really focused on in the last couple of years, but COVID has accelerated, I think, the need to focus on that. So law firms are having to address the welfare of their staff more than ever, and understand that this is placing enormous burdens on people, even if it's also creating opportunity. And as far as, you're working from home, maybe you get to see more of your family now, you're not commuting, but you are perhaps not dividing your day very much. You're there with the computer, potentially able to work 24 hours a day across 7 days. And I regularly speak to colleagues, because I'm dealing with people who work internationally, and they're having a conference at 10 o'clock at night. They're having a conference, they're getting up at 3 a.m. because of time zone differences. And maybe it's always been like that since the introduction of the internet and the way of communicating has evolved. But it feels to me that constant level of accessibility, which I suspect people in private practice more than most, has its massive downsides on the mental well-being side. I mean, knowing that you're permanently contactable, and maybe that your clients expect a response on Monday morning, first thing, having given you something late Friday, that is, I think, something that needs to be hugely reduced and addressed. And we know it's systemic within the model of private practice. How do you really address that if it's a functioning model that they want to retain? But if it's having a deleterious effect on people's well-being, and that's the statistics from our survey, We'll make sure those are publicised, and we'll make recommendations around this. Perhaps at least gradual change can start to happen, and in part brought about by the changing demands that COVID has put on all of us.
Absolutely. I think you're right. People find it exceedingly difficult to delineate their day, their working day, and their leisure time. And, we all praise Zoom, but the reality is, if you're in an international role, you're talking about all the different time zones. The fact that you can get on Zoom and have meetings with people across 3-4 different time zones means that, yes, for somebody it's middle of the night, and that is very hard to say no. Plus the extra stress on your eyes and the lighting and all of the things that does to your sleep patterns and your stress and your sort of body chemistry, etc. Plus the fact that, lawyers really do love certainty, and there's never been a more uncertain time with COVID, because people just don't know when it's ending. And so I'm foreseeing that this year is going to be a year of burnout. Burnout is something that happens very quietly in the background in law generally, but I think that this year it's really going to come to the fore, because this heightened awareness of mental health is something that's affecting everybody. But as you say, the legal profession, it's one where it's a high pressure, high stress environment anyway, with long hours. And the fact was, though, that people used to commute, and they used to, at least have limits, such as the last train. You'd be working, but then the last train would be at sort of 11:30. So you'd sort of run for that, and you'd be able to get home, and you'd at least have that break where you were commuting, and you could say validly, well, I was on my way home. And you'd get home, and then people wouldn't expect you to be on Zoom at 1 a.m. No. But now it's almost like there are just no time frames. There's all kind of reasonableness has kind of been thrown out the window, and there's such a sort of panic and general feeling that, well, financial disaster could be just down the road, so we have to capitalize on now. If we're busy in our law firm right now, well, we can't say no. We just have to go with it. And it's like, well, okay, go with it, but there's a limit to what we're going to do here, because how much steam have these people got? And the reality of, the adrenaline rush that we had in the initial phase, people are kind of still on that, and the levels of anxiety and the levels of exhaustion are just like really mounting up. And I think a lot of people are going to hit the wall.
And I think it's been the anxiety of people who've got children working from home as well, homeschooling those, trying to balance that. And I know it's had a really adverse impact on women. And, one of our other projects involves a 9-year study about women in senior positions in jurisdictions. We're trying to track the data and look at the initiatives and see what's working. And we're going to launch the pilot of that in March, hopefully on International Women's Day. But I think, that's really going to show, I suspect, the impact of COVID, and we'll chart that over time. But it's going to show potentially much more, challenges out there for women reaching senior positions if they're trying desperately hard to juggle what this year has essentially created for them. Whether that means, more permanent or temporary career impacts, we'll see. But we know globally and across every walk of life, women are being adversely affected by it.
Yes, I mean, that in itself is a huge topic for its own podcast.
Another time. But yes, I mean, that's something I'm passionate about as well, to see, real kind of women achieving what they can without having to sacrifice too much. There's always a balance, but you can have children, you can do well in your career, and appreciate there are different career choices. I've not chosen one which gives me massive salary and all of the kind of opportunities to some extent that financially I would have got from going into private practice. But I've done well enough. But the main thing is you enjoy what you do. I think that's have purpose, have a sense of fulfillment and real passion about what you do, and you can't go far wrong.
Yes, so I mean, that leads so beautifully into what I was just going to say, which is, when you're thinking of young lawyers right now, what advice, based on your personal experience, what advice can you give of the young person today just thinking about a career in law or just starting out?
It's what you want to do and you believe in it, really be passionate. Don't just go into it because it's what your parents expect of you, or, you can't be bothered to think of anything else and you happen to be clever, therefore it'll do. I think it's really important to feel passionate about it, passionate about justice, about the rule of law. In any transaction, in any type of law that you practice, that's the bedrock of it. So if you believe in that and you're passionate and you think as a lawyer you can make a difference somewhere, then it's a fantastic career. And I can't really comment on private practice, but I do know from the colleagues I've met, they seem, a lot of them, that they love their work. They've carved out a niche of practice which they enjoy. But if you don't, you leave. I mean, you often get enough skills from training and going through, the various stages to take you in different directions. But be flexible. Never have a fixed mindset on when you enter a career choice, because it can go in a variety of directions, as mine did. I certainly didn't realise when I started out, over 20 years ago, that I'd end up going in the different directions that I have. So I would say to young lawyers, pursue the law if it's what you want to do. Take different opportunities when they arise, and be brave, be bold, be willing to explore. Say yes as often as you can, but also know your limits and be reasonable and be kind of kind to yourself. And I'm hoping that we're seeing change. We're seeing a recognised and acknowledged awareness of the impact of unsafe or unhealthy work conditions, whether it's in treatment of others, whether it's in ours, mental well-being, bullying and harassment. All these things are at the fore, and diversity and inclusion as well. All these things are really becoming key for law firms. It's almost as if they have to compete against each other to show who's got the most in place, who's doing really big things in that space. And the opportunities as well for doing pro bono work within those organisations have increased. They want to show their corporate social responsibility. They want to be busy in that area as well. So there's lots of rewarding opportunities, I think, in private practice that perhaps weren't there as much when I was starting out. So I would, definitely advocate it as a career choice, but be aware of what you're getting into and be, set your limits as much as you can. I appreciate it's hard, but we have interns in the team who every 3 months we get a new batch of interns who support our work and do research for us. And they're all incredibly bright and really eager. And, it's hard. It's not easy to get that job, but I think the rewards are there. And follow your heart.
I love that. Follow your heart. That's a great way to end our podcast. So thank you very much, Sara Carnegie, for your time today. So where can people reach you if they want to, meet you or carry on a conversation?
I'm at the International Bar Association, so you can Google that. And I head up I'm the director of the Legal Policy and Research Unit. So you can find me and my contact details on the website.
Great. Well, we'll also put some details in the footnotes to this podcast. So thank you very much. And thank you. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you very much to all our listeners. So please do like and subscribe to the Legal Genie podcast. Thanks again.
Thank you. See you soon. Care, Lara. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Legal Genie podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts and give it a rating and review to help others find it. Please do subscribe so that you don't miss the next exciting episode of the Legal Genie podcast. Thanks for listening. Have a magical week ahead.